Kristie Dotson and Alisa Bierria. Our exchange is entitled On Public Philosophy and Black Feminist Philosophy. Yes?
Yes.
Kristie, do you want to go first to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi. I am Kristie Dotson, a professor of philosophy at Michigan State University. Been there for about going on 13 years, I think. I work on Black feminist philosophy, epistemology, particularly epistemic oppression, kind of the ways in which bad things get in our head and we keep replicating them all, outside of radical material changes, and generally feminist philosophy, women of color feminist philosophy. Mm-hmm. So I think it's good for an introduction. What do you think?
Yeah. No, that's great. That's perfect. I mean, my name is Alisa Bierria. I am an assistant professor in ethnic studies at UC Riverside. I'm also a Black feminist philosopher. And my work is on feminist and queer carceral studies, gender violence, and I have a focus on agency. So how agency is socially constructed, the intersections between agency and epistemology, specifically intention, right? I'm really interested in intention. And I'm also a community organizer and have been for, 25 years, mostly in the feminist anti-violence movement. So I squeeze that in.
Yes.
Squeeze that in.
It's part of our conference today.
Yeah, exactly. So, I'm sure this conversation will just go hella organically. Kristie and I have known each other for a really long time. Kristie has been a critical mentor of mine. I would not be in philosophy without you, right? Mm-hmm. I'm talking to the people, and now I feel like that's gotten awkward. So let me just talk directly to you.
Yeah, I've been like, oh no.
Kristie saved my life, saved my ass, as I was really struggling with the discipline and really like having a lot of alienation and so on. So anyways, it's always such a pleasure and a gift to share time and space with you, Kristie. So how do you define public philosophy? What has it looked like for you? What have you worked on and so on? Do you want to start?
Thank you for that. Nice words. I think that's such a good place to start, because we did meet at a point where you were like, you're in graduate school, folks they were what they were. Mm-hmm. We'll say it like that. Some of the work because you're a community organizer, some of the work that you were doing was not necessarily legible in front of a far more traditional crowd. And you remember what happened is Donna Marcano and I started to try to do that interstices, the Women of Color Feminism Journal for Hypatia special issue. And that's kind of where we got our first introduction, because you called up to me at some conference, I can't remember, and you were like, I was so mad at you. It is hard to be a Black feminist in professional philosophy. Like, what are you doing? And it was good. It was good.
I'm so embarrassed now.
No, you shouldn't be, because it was the kind of challenge. It was the kind of challenge that Donna and I took up, as Donna's also a Black feminist philosopher out of Trinity College. And, I was at Michigan State at this point, and I was like 4 or 5 years in. I was probably going to be going for tenure actually that next year when we put the call for papers out. And, we were having the same question. Denise James, has a musing about it. Like, can we really be and do Black feminism as the politics and this professional philosophy thing that seems to be so not aligning in any kind of, there's a very few, it seems like, organic intersections. And I think some of that is clustered around whatever public philosophy was supposed to be, which is an emerging question. Because when we met, nobody was asking that.
No.
Nobody was saying, what public, or promoting public philosophy, or caring about public philosophy, or thinking such a thing as public philosophy exists. Though there were people like you, I would think everybody I just listed that was doing some variety of it already, and sometimes under heavy burdens of unintelligibility and just crazy, just a lot of double, triple, quadruple work, right? To do what everybody else was doing and the things we actually wanted to do.
That's
So
right.
I think, that's, for the audience to frame our discussion, because we've been in this,
Yeah, no, that's right.
Figure this out at different stages, but certainly. So, I mean, I think how to define public philosophy is a hard one for me because I think of public philosophy on a spectrum. I think that's, so I'll start there. I think of philosophy for the public, which is what I think most people think public philosophy is. Like the most common definition is the HuffPost philosophers. Like I do philosophy for the public, and so they do some translation of something or just philosophy in a public venue, right?
Right.
So many people think that's public philosophy. That's on the spectrum. I think the thinnest of possible understandings of it, though, because you can do philosophy that's then accountable to the public, right? Which I think has a thicker relationship than, or it's a thicker notion, we'll say it like that, because it presumes a relationship. You cannot hold me accountable if you have no access to me. So philosophy that in some ways accountable to the public assumes some kind of relationship, but even that can be quite thin. I can think of philosophy accountable to some public, a specific public that can hold you accountable. That relationship is thicker. And because it's specified this here, that there. And then philosophy done outside the academy. Like I actually don't even want to talk about this reach notion. Like I'm in here and I'm reaching. I mean, philosophy done in community, philosophy done outside of the academy for whatever the functions and purposes of those. I think of that as public philosophy, mostly because for me, that is relationship driven. I'm only doing it because I know people. I'm only doing it because I'm involved. Right. And that kind of involvement, along with accountability, along with the ranges of relationships one is preserving, creating, maintaining. To me, I think of that as public philosophy. I know all of those can be called public philosophy. And I have engaged in all except for the first. I don't usually do the engagement in the New York Times and the Huffington Post. Not because I don't care what kind of way about it. I think it's people do it. Sounds great. I've not done that one. I've done the other ones though. So to talk about the projects that I have engaged in, I have been in some ways accountable, maybe only the last two really. Could I ever been held accountable to the public? No. I think haven't done that one, but I have done some public, right? Have worked in some ways with capital case defense lawyers. I have, and you came to, actually had breakfast with you after one of those startling, engagement with the capital defense lawyers, capital case. Woo, definitely, that's hard stuff. I actually think of philosophy as a kind of public that I've engaged, that I've had to be held accountable to. I think of, and I thought of it that way when I wrote, how is this paper philosophy? I knew I was writing to people in a domain that was populated who could speak back to me. I knew that. And I kept that project that way. Though it be an academic project, it was in the space of its engagement, which was academic philosophy. So when I got spoke back to, and I did, I had to write another piece called On the Costs of Socially Relevant Philosophy to explain, here's some unintended side effects to that thing I put out there. I did not mean to do that, but I'm not so far removed from this context. There are relationships here I am preserving. There are people I'm accountable to that says that I should write this follow-up. Don't do that. Like, don't be acting like we all in the same boat because you get to be diverse. That's not right. So I think there are ways in which I've done that one. I've done that one in a lot of different contexts. And then philosophy done outside the academy, I have been in any range of community fights, particularly with colonial structures, United States bureaucracy, anti-Blackness and anti-Black women and girlness. And I think that is something different. That is constantly something I get dragged into, that my skill set becomes valuable for because of who I know, right? And because who calls me, right?
Yeah.
They're like, I know what you can do. We need your help here. And, and then I go and do what it is I do there. There's not a lot of work that I've done in public gets
Mm-hmm.
written around that stuff. That stuff
Yeah.
is philosophy done in the world, and that's what it is. And its product doesn't always look like an article. In fact, it so much is never that. It honestly
Yeah.
sometimes looks like policy changes. I think about the fight about privatization of education in North Carolina that I undertook because my sister was involved, right? And so that kind of thing, and then trying to stop a certain kind of privatization from happening that got staved off there. But there ain't no articles about that, and it won't be. You know, I mean, maybe I'll mention it here and there, but it won't even begin to cover the amount of work and, in some ways, philosophical engagement it took to imagine a resistance to that machine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm a little bit overwhelmed with I appreciate you mapping out the kinds of public philosophy that you've been able to engage in and define, and or just identify and not necessarily engage in. I think that that's really helpful for me. I want to go back to the interstices special issue a little bit, because the reason why I was so, I saw the CFP and I was so rattled. Like I was like, oh, I should do this. But the argument in the CFP is that there's a tradition of women of color philosophy. And I was like, no, there, like that was my emotional reaction. And it was emotional because of the experience of almost universal whiteness in the academy, right? And so and that experience was something that I was constantly trying to bump up against and try to define myself despite, right? And when I was doing community organizing at the same time, and the work of organizing and of academic philosophy, the wall was so thick and stable because it had to be, because of the ways in which the structure was back then. So that was what, 2007 or something like that, 8, something like that. And so, and I got to grad school in 2005. And so I think that like coming out of years of organizing into academia, into the discipline of philosophy was complicated and alienating. And it did something to me. And so I think that when I saw the CFP, I was like, no, you're lying.
Who are you people? Yeah, I know. You told me.
I know. And so then we met
being
each
held
other
accountable.
At
I don't mind it.
No, I don't believe that I was right. That's the thing. I think the problem. Okay, so
go ahead.
I don't believe I was right.
Please, just go.
Okay, I don't believe that I was right, but I also don't believe I was wrong. So this is a complicated thing, right? And so, so we met each other at Feast in Arizona.
Is that where we were at? It was one of the feasts.
It was somewhere Southwest, and I just remember it like it was yesterday. And the CFP was still open. I was trying to figure out my way around it, and I was processing it with you. And that was one of the beginnings of me finding a language to define that alienation, which was really critical for me to lay a pathway towards public philosophy, which has only come to me in the past couple of years since I've become a faculty member. So I think as long as I was a graduate student, I just could not figure out a way to put them in conversation. And the great irony of that was that because people knew that I was an organizer and an academic, they kept coming to me to talk because they wanted me to be on panels to talk about being an activist scholar. And I would just be like, that sounds like a category that is harmonious. That's
not what we're talking about.
Right. And I'm like, these two warring bodies, right? That like these are two warring. Sorry, we had a previous conversation about Du Bois, so just that was an internal joke. But it was two warring souls, right, inside of my mind, and I was just like, I can try to figure out a way to have them talk to each other stop the war, put the weapons down, and try to build some kind of a coalition together, so that I could, just be more coherent in the body of work that I was producing, right? So the road to public philosophy was complicated and painful. And the road in philosophy is painful, right? But it was also a kind of reconciliation and an acceptance about the complexity of the work that I was doing, and that it was okay to do all the things, right? And to say all the things, and community organizing and in school. Then I was able to, I contributed an article to a book on field philosophy. And that article was called Grassroots Philosophy and Going Against the Grain. Here, I'll look up the editors of that anthology.
Would it have been Feldman? His name?
Yeah, let me see here. I'll look it up while you're talking, and we'll come back to it. Oh, here it is. Evelyn Brister and Robert Frodman. So it's called A Guide to Field Philosophy, Case Studies and Practical Strategies. So in that collection, I contributed an essay that talked about the philosophical production in the context of my grassroots community publics, right? And so the way that I think about public philosophy is that it's not academic philosophers going into the public to bring philosophy to the masses, which is obnoxious and racist, right?
Yes,
but
indeed.
But in my experience, it was working with organizers and survivors and artists and all kinds of folks, trying to do complicated knowledge production and argument development with really hard problems, like prisons are not sustainable. Like they are violent, and they are terrible for our communities. And we need a response to sexual and domestic violence. And both of these things are true. So how do we think through that tension, right? And so that was us basically practicing a kind of critical analysis, critical interrogation of that tension, and then reaching for some possibilities, right? Some hypotheses, some answers, right? To try to speak to that tension. And one of the things that I argue in that piece is that, is a kind of practice to theory model. So for us, what we did was we weren't on the same page with prison abolition when we started to, engage it or explore it with film festivals and so on. But what we decided to do was to organize the film festival, organize the conference. And through that practice of organizing and learning and speaking and talking, we were able to come to a working consensus around abolition. But then we had to figure out what, and so therefore what. And so then we collectively started to experiment with community-based forms of accountability to see what that could look like. And then from that practice, from those kinds of experiments and what we learned from there, we were able to write an article for Color Violence, the Insight Anthology, about some working principles for community accountability, which was one of the earliest articles on community accountability and transformative justice, like in terms of this wave in the past 20 years, right? So what I'm saying is, as philosophers, I think that usually in academic philosophy, we're trained to come up with a theory through logical deduction, right? and analysis. And then you test the theory, in practice, and you try to figure out if the theory, holds water. But I was in the context of organizing feminists of color, Black feminists organizing specifically. What I found is that it had to be practiced first, and then the theory would come from the practice. But in order to do that kind of thing, you had to, there had to be a level of community-based trust and humility, right? Not knowing what was going to happen. And so in that way, I think that philosophy creates publics, right? I think that it can help cultivate relationships, because if you're doing this work collectively in the context of a political project, you have to you have to trust one another, that everyone is coming in good faith. Everyone is doing their best to be as honest and thoughtful as possible, because you don't know what the answer is. You're feeling around in the dark. And so you need everybody to come together. So in that way, it's a kind of production of a public through the philosophy. So, yeah.
I mean, I like that. I loved all of that. I think that so much I would call my number 4 grassroots philosophy after that. Like when I think about philosophy done outside the academy, the relationships are so key. The accountability partners are so key. The stakes of the project are so key. And its products aren't always what people imagine they're going to be. I mean, you did produce 2 essays out of that, but you easily could not have. And I know for a fact that you've done a lot of that grassroots philosophy and never seen a paper come out of it, right? So there's all the ways in which what that is, and to me, the best part of philosophy, because here's what I always got to circle back to this, is how I think. I mean, philosophy is an everyday art. It really is. It's an everyday. It's an art. I say that, and I'll say it anywhere. I think it's first an art. Whatever it becomes in the academy is fascinating and interesting, but there's an art here. And there's an everydayness to the art that kind of gets lost. That it's constantly happening, philosophizing, philosophy. It's constantly happening. And in ways that we are no longer trained to gain wisdom or energy from. So part of, I think of public philosophy is actually not promoting that, because it's already fucking happening. Ooh.
Right.
Yeah. But anyway, it's already happening.
I think we can cuss. I think.
I'm sure, but I had a moment where I was trying, so I failed. But anyway, I think that it's already happening, and so the more we can find ourselves in these, recognize what we're doing in these moments where we actually don't know what to do. I love when you said that, because I often tell my students in my classes, particularly undergraduate and graduate classes, that when you don't know what to do, that's not where philosophy ends, that's where it begins. Exactly. That's when we have the most work to be done. We have to now recreate the ground under which our next step will be. And that step, you might fall into the pit. Man didn't hold water. Figure out exactly what happened there, but you got to take the step first. I think that to me is my favorite part of philosophizing when I'm doing it, right? So when I'm kind of put into the context where I'm accountable to a specific public, or when I'm accountable to my very near relationships, one's built, one's new, one's old. I think of exactly that space of when we don't know what to do next. So when I was asked to help out some capital case defense lawyers, had a defense lawyer really, in some ways, tried and seasoned, has tried more capital defense cases than lots of people, because they're very long and horrifying cases. Who asked, I heard your podcast. This would be philosophy for the public. I've done it. Podcast. I heard your podcast. I think this happens in capital defense cases. I'm out in California. Would you be willing to come and talk to some capital case defense lawyers about the relationship between, a defense strategy and maybe epistemic oppression? And I was like, listen, sir, I don't know nothing about that. Let's begin with, I don't know anything about that. I can tell you some stuff about epistemic oppression. And he was just like, just come tell me whatever you think. So I spent I don't even know I am no capital defense lawyer, but I spent months trying to figure out the landscape of defense law, of defense, capital defense. Like, so what is it? What is the mitigating phase? What is the penalty phase? It's not okay for me to go in there and like apply my theory. I was like, oh, fuck this theory. I don't even know if this is the theory this guy really needs. I mean, I don't know that. I don't know that until I try in my best to recreate as in many ways, non-expert, non-expert. I sent him questions as I had them, and he was very generous in being response, but there's my relationship building, right? I'm like, so I actually need your help recreating this. This is what it looks like to me. It looks like there's a penalty phase and then a mitigating phase. And the only person who has to change their story in a capital defense case are defense lawyers. I was like, that seems like a problem, right? It seems like a problem that y'all have to actually shift and change your story through one defense trial. Whereas the prosecutors can keep the same damn story at every single phase. I was like, you don't see the epistemic trick of that? We can call it epistemic oppression, but it's worse than that. This is something else. So when he was asking me for one thing, I was like, well, let me see what you're talking about first. And then let me give you, let me take the I don't know and turn this into a theory with research and community. Right? And conversation. And when I give you this talk, tell me I'm full of shit. I'm waiting for it. Tell me what I got wrong. Tell me what this, blah, blah, blah. Right? So that it's a back and forth until they find something useful or they don't. Right? And that's okay. And in many ways, I think that there were times in talking to the capital defense lawyers when I did that, they were like, so this part, no. But this part, I think is maybe worse than you think. Right? Because of these other things that I would never know anything about. And that is public philosophy. We're doing it together. We're reconstructing what this type of problem looks like and this type of structure with this kind of mechanisms, right? Right. And that can't be done in the privacy of your own home. You can't sit there, no matter how much I researched capital defense. It wasn't going to be enough. Right?
No, you can't do it siloed.
And nor exactly, it can't be done in silos. And the application model is just I'm telling you, I've never written what they need to make sense of this. Don't get me wrong. He was identifying some things in my wheelhouse, but I haven't written that paper. And I was like, okay, I mean, I might write that paper. I've got copious amounts of notes on it. But, I think in the end, I had to, with him, come up with what they need. And now there are cases, capital defense cases that say they're using the terms. I get called all the time because the work that when you do a big seminar, particularly a capital defense seminar, all of those materials go into a larger national registry that people can then look for. So every now and then I get an inquiry from someone saying, I got this kind of case, I got this kind of problem, does this apply? I guess there's an application thing. But before, there was no such, I couldn't have thrown my shit out there and said this. Right? No, it doesn't, it's not for me, that's not public philosophy. They need something they can use. They're not doing it for fun. And I think to a certain degree, I learned so much about my concepts, what they didn't do and what they did, what I should have to build to make sense of a structure like this legal structure. And in some ways, helped me to think through what would be accumulating epistemic power, which is a very difficult paper for me to write, kind of about the kind of statutes that allow for violent force when enforcing a warrant. And they're everywhere. And we just saw a case of this and figuring out exactly how, that's where epistemic power comes from. I was like, in this case, epistemic power is given to capital prosecutors, period, by the structure. They have it. You don't. That's all we have. So I got power. There's always been power, obviously. But the way in which that concept comes together in talking about what happens with Michael Brown Jr. is exactly, from this engagement with these lawyers, right? With these defense lawyers talking about what these particular things afford in terms of epistemic power, right? And I'm like, that doesn't come from this bench and this table. That comes from the relationships, it comes from the back and forth, it comes from attempting to do work in the world, but not bring your work to the world. And those things, and let's turn this back to Black feminism. That's so Black feminist of us to do. I mean, it is. I often laugh about Patricia Hill Collins, Pat Hill Collins, because she'll be like, if it don't lead to action, what kind of theory is it?
What's the point? What's the project? Exactly.
What's the point? And not just, I know this better now. Like, towards what range of actions? Because do you actually know it better if you can't actually act on it? I mean, I think there are ways in which, even the way in which that academic philosophy on this side of the wall identifies its finished product, that would not fit well with the Black feminist praxis. You're like, that's an underdone theory. The fuck am I doing with that? I mean, what am I going to do with that theory? I mean, okay, great. Now, the people might not be here, but can you tell me why it matters? I know it does. I know it does. I know it does. I can maybe think about it, but if you could make that be part of how you teach me that concept, I really appreciate it. But of course, you ask that question so often in class, they're like, you're changing the subject from the deep theoretical stuff we're trying to do here that's so far outside the practical matters. And you're just like, and that's a practical decision, that you don't care about practical matters.
Yeah. That's right. Like, and it's a political decision.
And it's a political decision. You're like, I have politically decided that I don't care about practical matters. And by the way, I'm one of those random people who thinks that's their right. I'm an artist. I'm a philosophy as an artist.
Sure.
It is your right to decide art for art's sake. It is not your right to decide anything that isn't art for art's sake is not art. That you don't get.
That's the rub. That's the rub.
That is the rub.
So if it's not dense enough, or if it's not completely unreachable, then it's not real philosophy. Yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, when I think, and so we talk about, so me and you talk about this all the time. I think of philosophy as an art. I do not have the notion that philosophy has to be this dense thing that people have very, difficult to get into. Though, as we know, between your work and mine, yours is more readable, right? So you're like, yeah, you say that.
We'll just see what happens.
That man heard a podcast. He did not read a paper. Your papers don't look like that. And I really think it's a generational difference. So one of the things that in meeting you, because we may have met a little farther, 2008 is when I got to MSU, and I met you maybe around 2012. 2012 is 13ish, because that's when the call for papers would have went out.
Okay.
So I will say, in that 4 years of 2008 to 2012, I had very similar reservations. Me and Donna, when we put that together, we're thinking, and I told you this when we spoke, this shit is performative. It'll be what we say it is. We're gonna
be until you make it.
I said what I said. Right? You're like, what? Who cares? Like, like the tradition, like any of these traditions aren't manufactured for some political purpose in any given moment. The canon, the Western canon, and it's ridiculous compliance with a colonial expansion, and its erasure of anything that doesn't. Listen, as far as I'm concerned, every canon that's ever been constructed was produced for a political purpose. So as we were sitting down thinking about that, we were like, so it doesn't exist. Oh, but it will. And when it does, we're going to be able to operate out of it. It's going to make it so much easier, because she and I are still in the world of this I don't know if you want to call it a performance of theory, because I actually am a dense writer. Just how I am. When I'm not writing densely, I worked very hard and I burned thousands and thousands of words. And what I mean by that is, for every sentence, I probably threw away 3 paragraphs. I'm a very dense writer. That's just naturally how I write. But I do think we weren't thinking you had to do that. But certainly when I was coming up, those of us who did were highly rewarded. Right. So then you have something I say in House Purpose Philosophy, or in the cost of the socially relevant paper. I'm like, don't look at this like this is the way it should be. It just so happens that this is how I write this stuff. But we all know this is not how it should be. Our valuation should not be valuing just this. Right. It shouldn't be valuing whatever this is. It's not wide enough. This is an everyday art. It's an everyday art. So what we're selecting as having value is always too narrow. But it is, I think, surprising how often public philosophy, the kind that you're talking about, grassroots work, gets selected out. I think it's changing. but it was not changed in any way when I came through, nor you. So when you were kind of like saying, what are you talking about? I'm like, yeah, I know we got to make this up. But, you know, we can do it. Me and you and everybody else who's involved in this, you know, we can do it.
Well, it's a perfect example of practice to theory, right? You just kind of like, I'm just going to make it. I'm going to speak it. I'm going to do a freaking special issue, and the women of color philosophers will come. And we did.
I do feel like the everyday activity of grassroots philosophy, as you've described it, to me is one of the things that even in academic context, I still think that it mirrors a similar structure, unless you're doing commentary, right? Unless what you're doing is trying to figure out what Kant said about something. But those of us who are looking at lacunas and being like, well, what is there? What should be there? What do I want to be there? I think the grassroots philosophy model is the model. I think you do go from practice to theory. You know, I think you spend more time in practice than you do in theory. And I think that, and the theory is made to go back to practice.
Yes, it's circular.
You know, you're like, not supposed to be sitting there in theory.
That's right.
I mean,
that's the thing. And we really have to figure it out, because like come to some consensus about the fact that philosophical production is happening outside of philosophy, outside of academia. I'm thinking specifically in social movements, but that's not only where it's happening, right? So, and one of the other thing that was so complicated for me in that period that you're naming, the early 2010s, was that shortly after that, abolition started to become more well-known in academic philosophy, and has been growing ever since. And that was hard for similar reasons, right? It's just like, oh, you know, I'm been disciplined to not talk about that in the context of the academia, and now there are issues and articles and whatnot, and I don't know what to make of it. And I think that part of the importance of figuring out how to thread together the story of philosophy and knowledge production that's emerging from social movements and knowledge production that's emerging in academia is to acknowledge that social movements catalyze that shit. You know what I mean? Like there would be no philosophers talking about prisons if there weren't organizers figuring out prisons, right? And so, you know, similar to gender violence, right? There's in the brilliant books that we have in analytic philosophy looking at sexual and domestic violence, which is, you know, I'm so grateful for. But those books could not exist, of course, and those authors would be the first to say, without all of the ways in which feminist, anti-violence, community organizers, and other kinds of activists shifted common sense, right? And so I think that that it's actually, now that I'm saying this out loud, it's actually kind of astonishing to me that philosophers think that they're bringing philosophy, or some of us, right, think that we're bringing philosophy to the people, right? And I think that's probably why there are many reasons, I think, why your pivotal paper, How Is This Paper Philosophy, caused waves. And I think that's one of them. I think there's multiple reasons, but I think that's one of them. Recognizing that that the way in which we were defining philosophy, we being academics, was actually pretty elitist and problematic, kind of racist. It's
all that.
So,
all of that. And, you know, then for those of us who are so inclined, it just was a nightmare. Like you talked about the struggle to get, you know, to do the philosophy training. You know, I was lucky I didn't do the whole undergraduate thing, but, you know, the graduate was bad enough. I was like, what the hell is this? Like, why is this so bad? Because I swear to you, I can do this work. I just don't want to accept these values. So how can I do this work without these values? Because I don't want, part of that's bullshit. And the other part is this
Mm-hmm.
art that I love, that I
Mm-hmm.
love to do this. And
Mm-hmm.
I love to be in community doing it. And I
Mm-hmm.
love when, the Capitol case, I had all kind of shit I probably should have been doing, maybe even that book for Oxford, but I was like, this is
Mm-hmm.
more important. Capital defense
Mm-hmm.
cases, let's get some folks off of, deprivation row. That's real talk. And then to have, people come back and be like,
Yeah.
oh, engaging in that work is just helping to solidify the system. I was like, boy, we need more philosophy in the world. Pay attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pay
No.
attention. Like really. But then it goes back to a real not understanding of the role of social movements, of the role of social agitation, of unrest to produce the common sense that then goes into what would be a theory paper.
Right. Exactly. Right. Here we go. Okay. So let's see. I guess we have to wrap up here. I think that one of the things I do want to say, since you were talking about the importance of life and death in your work, trying to get people off of death row, is that the relationship between Black feminist philosophy and public philosophy is so profound, because Black feminist philosophy, Black feminist philosophy saved my life, right? I mean, it made me legible to myself,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it put me in context, which was so critical. And so, anyways, I'm not sure. I know that there's a bridge between that and public philosophy. I have to think about what that language is. Maybe it's that I have been doing philosophy in multiple spaces, and that multiplicity. There is a Black feminist sort of tradition rooted in that multiple kind of location
Mm-hmm.
and context, right? So I wanted to put that out there as well before we closed up.
I agree. I think that when I stumbled into what what we're talking about is Black feminist philosophy, and we of course could have another, conversation with a bunch of Black feminists, like what do we mean by that? But, I think it is the case where I was like, okay, so I'm not just an overthinker and I'm not just crazy. There are other people who have thought these problems this way. They're not the only way to think them. And they're not, but they are ways, like you say, that are legible to me. They give me agendas, and actually they point me towards joy. And I think that's really important, because I'm like, I am one of those ones who may wrestle a lot with life and death in my work, and certainly in my public philosophy. But, it helps a great deal to think these things, think around them, understand them as far as I can get an understanding of them. But for the escape hatch, what Toni Morrison's like, I'm looking for the escape hatches, and we find them enough to not just survive, but so many of us to actually have joy, to have laughter. But that's a whole nother topic about what we think this does for us. But I do think the idea, I couldn't have philosophy, academic philosophy, whatever we get in the academy, could not have served any purpose for me without its public arms. It just wouldn't have. So what we're saying here is, it was only me finding my own version of those interfaces, which to me had varying levels of accountability, that made this a doable thing, and it made it legible for me. And I think that people who have that, and I imagine that people who are looking at this at Morgan State or Vanderbilt actually may feel the same. You are not alone. It's not just you, there may need to be some engagement, some community, some public component to this. And that it isn't just the not just life of the mind, but it is hard to do public philosophy the way we're talking about it. In some ways, far harder than to find a way to critique Kant's third, critique. far harder. Far more challenging.
The stakes are higher.
And the stakes are higher. And the stakes are higher. And so in some ways, I think that I didn't need Plato to tell me that, I want a good life. To me, I'm also focused on living well. And part of that is engaging in a future other than this, and a present different for other folks. What else is there to do? I mean, I don't want to do that. This is my art though. This is my heart, right? And so the art in some ways had to bend, I think for you and I, it had to bend towards us. And it wasn't towards us when we got here, but our insistent that it continues to bend towards us is, I think, also a Black feminist practice.
Yes. Yeah. That reminds me of Ella Baker too, where she says, the institutions are not, I can't remember exactly, but there's something about bending are made for us. And so if we, how can we be and engage institutions, be in and engage institutions that are not made for us? And so there must be more practices. I'm sort of building out on her quote, but there has to be an agenda to build more, to make the institution bend towards us, so that we can occupy it and thrive in it. Yeah, right. I think that's right. That's so beautiful. All right, we have to go. I'm so sorry to cut us out, but thank you so much, Kristie.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure.
To engage. I can't wait to see this. Okay, then. Bye, everybody. Right. Bye, friends. Y'all.